Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Barsuk. I am the Robert Herstick Professor of Medicine and Medical Education at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. I currently serve as the Executive Medical Director of Northwestern Simulation. I'd like to welcome you back to another podcast in our series on simulation and healthcare education. In this podcast, we will continue to discuss key issues in healthcare simulation-based education. Today, I have the distinct honor of interviewing Dr. David Gaba. David is the Associate Dean for Immersive and Simulation-based Learning and Director of the Center for Immersive and Simulation-based Learning at Stanford. He is Professor with tenure of Anesthesiology, Perioperative and Pain Medicine, and founder and co-director of the Simulation Center at the Veterans Affairs Palo Alto Healthcare System, where he also is a staff physician. David is considered a true pioneer in simulation-based education. And David, it's an honor to interview you today. And I kind of regret that it took so long for us to get together and do this interview.
Well, it's an honor to be interviewed by you.
All right. So we always start off our podcasts with a little bit of background. I find it fascinating how individuals got involved in simulation in the beginning. So if you could tell me how you first got started in sim, that'd be great.
Well, it was based on some background of me being a aviation and space nut for my entire life, starting age 7. Alan Shepard, the first American astronaut, was launched on my birthday, my 7th birthday. Those interests in aviation and space actually played a significant role in what was later to happen. So I got my undergraduate degree in engineering, what sort of passed in those days for biomedical engineering. But I did a bunch of other components to that, which was a lot of computers. I learned many different computer languages, did some stuff in human factors and so forth. But I knew that I wanted to go to medical school before I went to college. So it's sort of not surprising that during medical school, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, originally I thought maybe emergency medicine, but then as I got to know some anesthesia people better and did an anesthesia rotation, I decided that would be the thing for me, and ended up at Stanford. And then after finishing my residency, was hired at VA Palo Alto. Actually, I was hired as a Stanford person, but seconded to the VA, where I've been for almost 41 years now. And actually, being at the VA turned out to be an important deal because it was less crazy in the ORs and stuff than over at Stanford. So I was able to get more non-clinical time to work on my research, which at first was on things I'm not going to bother to go into, but had nothing to do with what I was going to do a few years later. And the reason that I sort of got interested in, well, there was no simulation in healthcare at that time. We're talking about the 1985, 1986 kind of period, except for the resuscianes and stuff for CPR. But I had an interest in how we all worked, how we learned to do what we did in anesthesia, how we did that kind of work where things happen in seconds, minutes, and hours, not in days, weeks, months, and years. And one of the things that tipped me into organizational safety theory, which is sort of a part of this story of getting into simulation, there was a book published called Normal Accidents. And I read about it in one of the science magazines I typically read. I can't remember which one. And it was from a guy named Charles Perot, who goes by Chick, actually. And he was the only sociologist on the committee that investigated the 3 Mile Island disaster, near disaster, I guess I should say. And in that book, he talked about what he called normal accidents, which were kinds of accidents that grow out of things that otherwise might be normal, but became abnormal, and then people had to deal with that. And the book had sections on 3 Mile Island and on the nuclear power stuff in general, and about aviation and about maritime and various other things. And every page as I was reading this book, I said, "This sounds just like anesthesia." And so I actually, my research associate at the time called him up and said, we're very interested in this and working on trying to apply some of this to our own business. And he said, "Oh, well, I'm going to be in Palo Alto in a few months and I'll come visit you," which he did. And so that sort of got us started. And then my research associate, Mary Maxwell, and I, and my medical student research associate, well, showing my age, I'm blocking on his name, but it'll come to me. But we wrote a paper that was, I think is now considered a significant paper that was published in Anesthesiology on anesthetic mishaps breaking the chain of accident evolution. And among the things we talked about in there was, that we needed as a profession to understand better how we all think in responding to complex situations, and some other things about how it's done in these other arenas, including the notion of simulation training and the use of simulation to understand what we're all doing. So at the time, we'd been doing research involving animals, mostly canines. And so we said, well, to do these kinds of studies, we could bring people to the dog lab and make bad things happen and then see how they respond to these things. He said, well, the dogs are expensive. The animal rights people would be very upset. You pretty much could only use one dog at a time. And anyway, we said, well, what we really need is a simulator. And we looked around, and as I said, there were really the only CPR simulators, and that wasn't really what we needed. But being that I was an engineer and my medical student research associate, he was also an engineer, EE from Stanford, before he came into medical school. So being engineers, we looked around and said, well, there isn't really one, so maybe we can make one. And so we did, and started putting stuff together from, it was just a few years after personal computers had been made available. And so now everybody had a computer, and I think I had an early clone of the IBM personal computer. And that's what we started working with, and then some others, and just cobbled a bunch of things together. Nelcor gave us a stimulator for the pulse ox so that we could dial up whatever pulse ox readings we wanted to. Typically, it was just with a hand thing, but you could hook that up to a computer. And we the very original, actually, and right this time is about exactly 38 years since our first pre-prototype simulation, which was with my fellow Mary Maxwell in the hot seat, and it was a tension pneumothorax during upper abdominal surgery. So we were able to cobble that together, and we recorded all the utterances and took a few pictures, and that led us then to submit an application to the APSF in the very first round of the grant program. And we were successful in getting that grant. People were very, very positive in the reviews. I guess I should say extremely positive. And that's what allowed us to actually go from this prototype to making something that could be used sort of on an everyday basis, though just still cobbled together by us and didn't end up leading to being made commercial, some years later. But and that allowed us in the late 1980s and very early 1990s to do a number of these projects on giving people various different levels of experience in anesthesia a set of circumstances to deal with, and then to see how they responded. And so we had done some early residents in their first, starting I think in September of their first year, and then we did later residents. And in those days, we only did 2-year residencies after internship. So because we were so smart, back then. But and then we did some also with highly experienced people, both attendings at Stanford or the VA, and some clinical people from the outside who we knew. That led to a whole bunch of papers and to more and more versions of the simulator, and then to it being commercialized. The biggest thing we did in simulation was, even though our primary interest was in the research on understanding the decision making, we knew it would be useful, very useful for training and maybe assessment and so forth. As part of my looking into all sorts of things about organizational safety and aviation and other things, I came across what was then fairly new in the late 1980s, which was cockpit resource management, or CRM, in aviation, which was a new paradigm of how they were approaching training and assessing high level people. So people who, flew every day, every year they needed simulation training. And the cockpit resource management, then called crew resource management, that we adapted to be, since nobody in anesthesia really thought about cockpits and even crews, we called it crisis resource management, but same sort of terminology, and CRM, and adapted that into anesthesia initially, and started doing simulation-based courses for our residents, and then for people from the outside, experienced people, starting in 1990. And that became a big hit. Was then promulgated to the Harvard hospitals through Jeff Cooper, who brought me out there for sabbatical, and then got promulgated to all sorts of other people in anesthesia, and then emergency medicine and neonatology and obstetrics. But a lot of that was because of our pioneering work in adapting this whole other paradigm of how we work, how to get us to work better, and both on the one side of dynamic decision making, and on the other side of teamwork and team management and things like that. All that's, as you well know, being done all over the world, and in all sorts of healthcare arenas, and by all sorts of healthcare disciplines and domains. And yeah, so that's how it got started.
And when you hear about the patient safety movement and how it all got started, anesthesiology is the one professional group that, really started all the patient safety movement and really was an advance. But when you learn about that and you take the coursework on patient safety, no one talks about simulation. And it's clear that that was a key component and what was going on with the crisis resource management and, applying organizational safety theory to what we were doing at the time.
Yeah. And I also became an aficionado of another one of there are now many versions of organizational safety theory. It was called high reliability organization theory, or HRO. And it so happened that the key HRO people that kind of started all that were at Berkeley, just across the bay. And I came in contact with a bunch of them, but I got significantly into the HRO side of things, which was looking at arenas in which they did complex and dangerous things on a regular basis, but with a very small, but not zero, but very small incidence of errors or significant problems. So the aircraft carrier was the first one they started, the flight deck of aircraft carriers. And they went out on three of these scientists went out on an aircraft carrier for a couple of weeks. I've actually since met the commander of that aircraft carrier who got involved with them also. And there was, in San Diego, one of the carriers is there to, you can go through. He took me and a colleague on a tour of the whole aircraft carrier. And yeah, I mean, it turned out there were a lot of similarities there too, because I what I like to call things like anesthesia but other things, but especially in anesthesia and ED and stuff like that, it's intrinsically hazardous. It's not just hazardous when we make mistakes or when, we screw things up. It's intrinsically hazardous. Well, what I say is evolution didn't intend for human beings to be rendered unconscious, insensitive to pain, amnestic, and often paralyzed. So it's just anytime you do that, even if it's the healthiest patient for the most, minor anesthetic, it's intrinsically dangerous, like flying. Yeah, patients are in airplanes and all that stuff, but there's so much to learn. I like to say sometimes, their pendulum is out here and what they've been doing, and ours is over here. Well, we don't need to go all over to there. We just need to go halfway or something. We will have learned a lot and been able to apply a lot. And I think that still holds for all these different arenas and vice versa. I was at the biomedical engineering people, Amy, they held a experts workshop with people from nuclear and people from healthcare, many from anesthesia, together to talk about the things that were issues and problems and stuff in each of the arenas and comparing them and learning from each other. I published part of the whole thing. It was all together as a monograph, a big monograph, and I had one big paper in there about these things from our side. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities at all these things. I think anything that's intrinsically dangerous, has these similarities. But yes, people are very different. And one day in the OR, you may be doing, or maybe even a baby in the room, and then the next patient in that room, depending on where you are, this might happen, is a 400-pound adult. And I mean, it's just there's so many different things and so many different things wrong with or about the different patients, and yeah, and we don't even know how our fundamental materials for having people anesthetized, we don't even really know how they work. We know more than we did 50 years ago, but we don't know exactly how it all works. But
All right, so the $1,000,000 question: do we know really how to teach crisis resource management and high reliability organizations to a point where we can measure it and show the effects using simulation? At least I'll let you talk to that. I have my own opinions.
Well, actually, your work is what I call the poster child for how you can climb the ladder as you guys did. Yes, you can use simulation to sort of try to understand how people are working, but to measure, if you teach them something with or without simulation and you test them in simulation, are they better? That's the first step. And yes, that can be shown, at least in some cases, they're better in simulation. Okay. Well, then you want to go out and see if you watch them work clinically, are they better having received the training with simulation, let's say? And well, yeah, in the central line case, yeah, they definitely were. Okay. Well, that's really good. Well, then you want to go out and you want to watch them do real clinical work. And are the people who got the simulation training better in doing the clinical work and actually just doing it, and then in the outcomes? Well, yeah, that was true too. And it actually saved money as well as saving people and stuff like that. And that's wonderful, climbing that ladder of research from benchtop to the patient, but from simulation to the real patients. That's great. However, but what I've written about is that poster child is very circumscribed in terms of, what it is and how you do it and, what you need to teach it, and that we do surveillance for many of the side effects of the doing of it. We didn't have to make that up, already making sure that people didn't have a pneumothorax. We were already doing that and so forth. And the training itself was pretty circumscribed on specific things that people did, all of which are very important. And I think it's an amazing thing you all did. But in trying to apply it to the rest of what we do, much of which is more complicated in a whole variety of ways, that's going to be much more difficult. Now, I have written, in principle, today, you and I could write down on a piece of paper, pretty much have done already in various times, how you would go about doing these studies for proof positive that simulation climbs that ladder and has a major impact on the outcome for patients and on costs, all that stuff. We can write down those studies, but they would probably take thousands, maybe tens of thousands of patients, hundreds or maybe more of the clinicians, studies that last not, I don't know how long yours took, but let's say a year or so, or for, I don't know, any given site. These others would probably take 5 or 10 years, and they would cost a ton of money. And unlike pharmaceuticals, and I've written this editorial based on a paper that Matt Wenger wrote on sort of thinking of simulation as if it was a pharmaceutical, and it has how strong is it and how many, how much do you need to take, how often, all of which is very sensible. But I looked at it from sort of the higher level in terms of, like, in this case, well, who would pay for it? It's not like the pharmaceutical business where they do lots of long, complex studies that cost a lot of money. But if and when they find a blockbuster, they make billions of dollars out of it. And that is not likely going to happen in the rest of the healthcare arena, or our kind of healthcare arena. So in principle, we would like to do these big studies that would be proof positive to everybody. By the way, actually, aviation has never had level 1 kind of proof positive that people are expecting in healthcare. You would not get the pilots nor their unions to let them fly without training and assessment with simulation, because they do go down with the ship. On the other hand, to me, it's great that people have voted with their feet, and simulation gone from, not counting the CPR mannequins and stuff, from one simulator and 2 simulators back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, from 2 outfits that were doing it, not counting the ones only on the computer screen, but that too, to where like zillions of people all over the world are doing it. So I think that it has made an impact on healthcare, but showing it, with the kind of level 1 information that people want to see, the proof positive, is going to be very hard. It can be done in some arenas, but it's going to be very hard to convince everybody. But I think they have been, especially for trainees, voting strongly with their feet. With experienced people, well, the story there of where simulation had become a required part of maintenance of certification in anesthesia, they were starting down that road in emergency medicine, but never even, there were some small trials, never got there. And then in anesthesia, we still have the MOCA simulation and people still come, but the incentives and stuff in the MOCA system have been reduced over the years. So this is another big difference between aviation and nuclear power and our business. Nuclear power, there's a batch of people, I don't know, 50, 100 people, whatever, who run a nuclear power plant 24/7 for like 6 weeks. Okay. And then another crew comes in and starts running the plant. The other guys do simulation. So they get simulation. I don't know exactly how much, but they get a bunch of simulation like every 6 weeks, they're back to doing simulation again. Even in aviation, it's only like once or twice a year. And in, MoCA, it was twice in 10 years. So we're quite far from any of, especially the nuclear arena. But on the other hand, there's only like 100 or 110 or something nuclear power plants in the US, and fewer every month or whatever. That's another thing. Healthcare is arranged in it's sort of a disorganized thing all over the country in all sorts of different ways in different places. Whereas, so like there's only like 12 aircraft carriers. So, HRO from an aircraft carrier, that's unique to, you look at these other kinds of settings, it's completely different from the organizational side and the higher level side and so forth.
Well, they have one boss for the aircraft carriers. So, or the FAA, one regulatory body that can put forth mandates. We have some regulatory bodies, but everyone gets to beat to their own drum and do whatever dose of simulation they feel is appropriate, and sometimes none. And, it's sad to me that MoCA kind of has died off a little bit, because some of the data that came out of there showing the variability and skills of practicing anesthesiologists was shocking. And that's a way to eliminate variable skills. And, you're absolutely right. We can't measure everything, because things like crisis resource management or team training and even organizational behavior is very hard to measure and attribute to simulation in the end. So at some point, we just have to take that leap of faith and say it's time. The question is when. And if aviation's done it and the nuclear power plants have done it, and people are dying left and right in our hospitals from adverse events, how come medicine is so delayed in accepting it widely and giving good doses of it?
Well, I think some of it is, as I said, A, we don't go down with the ship. B, we don't harm the means of production. C, lots of people all of us are going to die. And almost all of us in countries like ours are going to die in proximity to healthcare. Okay, so figuring out which ones were kind of sort of supposed to happen, if you will, versus those that really, were not, is not so easy. I also use a metaphor of when people talk about like some of the early research that was done, like, how often there were things that were iatrogenic in origin as opposed to things that were due to the nature of the disease. And that's the deal in healthcare is, sure, there's lots of people who are really sick or have abnormalities, and they die, or they have a really bad outcome of some sort. But then there's the ones that really shouldn't ought to happen, but it's not so easy to tease them apart. And that's another difference. In the aviation business, they'll probably know about 95% of the time. Yeah, there's so many things that make healthcare more complex.
Well, let's segue a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about your current role as Associate Dean for Immersive and Simulation-based Learning at Stanford. So can you talk about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis or a yearly basis in that role?
Yeah, so I have the pleasure of overseeing both an organization, which is the Center for Immersive and Simulation-based Learning, and then a physical space, which is the Hanmei and Joseph Goodman Immersive Learning Center. They're our primary donors, and we're now very close friends with them. And that's a 28,000 square foot immersive learning center, which includes a large fraction, but not all of the simulation in Stanford itself. The VA is sort of an independent satellite of Stanford. They've been connected for many, many years, which has its own simulation center. And actually, there's a number of other simulation centers in the Stanford system, many of which I've had a hand in helping to get started, and they're not so much their operations, but helping them to get going. And including, there's a surgical simulation center, there's a neonatal, some pediatric simulation center, there's a The neurosurgeons have a simulation center mostly for case planning and some training, but they also have some of that in the OR for use in the OR, bringing up the MRIs and stuff, and maybe some augmented reality there too. I've had a hand in mentoring and training a lot of the people who have started those programs, as well as a lot of in situ and peri situ simulation that goes on in the institutions. I coined the term peri situ. In situ occurred was known before, but sometimes people can't get an actual bed or bedside to do simulation in, but they can do the simulation in the conference room of that unit or in the hallway in that unit. And so peri in Greek means nearby. And so it's a near the place simulation. So both in situ and peri situ. There's lots of that goes on, both for training and for systems probing, which I think is really important. In our big immersive learning center, we have combined the standardized patient aspect of simulation and the other aspects of simulation that are part task training, some things that are completely non-technological, that are verbal or in various ways. There's the part task physical stuff. Then there's a lot of stuff with mannequin-based simulation, both very simple things and full-blown kinds of things. And then we and some of the spin-offs and or independent other people have been doing some work on with virtual reality and augmented reality. Some of the work I was doing with that got stalled because of COVID, and we've only now started to get going again. Though the business models have changed to make it a little more, well, not more difficult, but more expensive. But I think that's going to be an important arena of simulation. It's already been, some part of it, but I think it will grow quite a bit. I also think that AI is going to end up playing a significant role in the further development of the XR, VR, AR kinds of stuff. So yeah, it's really, I've had the pleasure of being, if you will, the big cheese. I was one of the first decanal level people on simulation in the country or the world, and it's been about 20 years or so now.
Let's talk about in January 2006 when the first edition of the Journal of Simulation and Healthcare was published, and somehow you became the founding editor. Tell us the story behind that, because that's fascinating how a journal comes to fruition and then actually doesn't just die off. It becomes very successful.
Well, so the Society for Simulation in Healthcare decided, and this is, I and Dan Raymer and many others were pushing that one of the key things for this organization would be to have a very serious journal. And there were, well, I don't know how many people applied, but there were two candidates in the end. And I'm not going to say who the other candidate was. A very nice person, but I ended up being the one selected. It's, creating a journal from scratch is, I'd been on the editorial boards and a little higher at a few journals, and had done a lot of that kind of work. So I knew kind of what it was about, but not in how you do it from the beginning. Had some people who were good advice and stuff, but we went through the process and, we decided we'd only start publishing. I think at the time it was only 4 times a year. And then we later went up to 6 times a year and so forth. The society was supportive. Dan Raymer was the key negotiator who negotiated the contract with our publisher. And there was some money to be made by the society from the journal. Yeah, so we grew from sort of, it was good because we had a lot of people already in the simulation and patient safety arena who did write, were doing things that were academically appropriate, scientifically appropriate, and chose to publish some things with us rather than, perhaps not surprisingly, the major journals were only modestly interested at the beginning. But then as simulation got bigger, and then I think also having the other journal help, the journals like Anesthesiology and A&A and so forth, became more interested and more willing to publish stuff. Some about simulation, but more as time went on that use simulation to study other things, which was sort of as I'd mentioned before, that was our primary reason originally for creating the simulator, was to do studies, to use simulation as a tool to help us understand other things, like about the work we do and how we do it. The fact that this has made the other journals more willing to publish in simulation is a great thing in some respects. For our journal, it was a bit of a negative because we lost a lot of good papers that we would have loved to have published, but we're very happy with what we got started and then what has blossomed over time, along with the society itself. One of the precursors to the society and the IMSH meeting way back in the 90s were the Rochester simulation conferences. I don't know if you were in things back in the day. And this is a metric I like to use, is those were in Rochester, New York. And one of the events was everybody went to Lindsay Henson's house for dinner. So I think it was maybe at the most on the second one of those, maybe 50, 70 people or so. Well, now the IMSH meeting is over 3,500. They tell me it was over 4,000 people. So, and I was one of the 7 initial founding board members. So that and the journal itself, to see what's happened with both of those things and the growth that they've actually had after coming from the wishes of just a handful of people many years ago is really very gratifying. And even though we don't have the proof positive, we're pretty sure that there are a number of people around whose lives or hearts or brains or whatever have been helped or saved by things directly stemming from simulation in one way or another. And I like to end a lot of my talks with the notion that there's a saying that's so good, it appears in both the Hebrew Talmud and the Muslim Quran, that whoever saves a life, it's as if they've saved we would now say all of humankind. And I think that in simulation, we have lots of instances in which I think people can honestly believe that they have saved a life because of simulation. So there's a lot of us working hard on that, and think that it has saved some lives and brains and hearts and stuff. That's a good thing to think about when we go to sleep.
And I think that's a perfect way to end this podcast. So thank you so much for sharing all that history and all your great work today on the podcast. It was really cool learning about all that stuff. So thanks. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. It was a lot of fun.
To our listeners, thank you for listening today. In future podcasts, we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.